Can you speak any Japanese?
What do you want me to say?
JSConf rocks.
JSConf はすごいです。
Okay, say it slower.
JSConf.
Can we all say that? JSConf
はすごいです。
すごいです。Without further ado, Jed.
All right, cool. I guess. All right. I'm gonna do like the weatherman thing here, ironically because of the volcano. But I'm here to answer for you guys one question, and that is, who are you and what did you do to Felix? Felix, I don't. Do you guys? Has anyone here met Felix at like the Europe JSConf? All right. So Felix is basically he is very active on Node. He's one of the first committers. He is super helpful, a really nice, friendly guy. And he was actually going to present this thing called Node Dirty, which is I love it. It's a very cool key value store. That's basically it says, listen, we're not going to handle the network thing. It's going to be on your machine, and it's just JavaScript all the way down. So you can use basically like on Couch, you would use. Actually, I think I have a slide for this. It's basically so it's NoSQL. And so basically, you have functions, and you just iterate over a huge set, and it returns keys. And because it doesn't go over the network, it's really fast. Anyway, so he was going to come present this, but he totally got volcanoed. But I did find, I tried to find a quote of someone who had actually known about Dirty. I haven't used it as much. This is the most authoritative opinion I could find. There is one bug if you guys are considering using it in your Node install, and that is it's not volcano proof. So I recommend you guys proceed with caution. And in the spirit for Felix, because he couldn't be here, I would like to, if possible, record a video of you guys just saying hi. So this is a huge leap of faith. But I'm just going to press record on this. You guys all, I'm sure, have iPhones. Don't gank my phone or turn it off. Can you just give him a short message? All right, let me put it on camera mode here. And just pass that around and give them a wave. All right, cool. All right, cool. So while they're doing that, what I do for a living is actually not code. As a living, I'm a freelance translator. I translate Japanese computer manuals into English. And so basically, all my code is just as a kind of a free time thing. Hopefully that transition, I would actually love to do that in a full-time capacity. But in languages, I speak 2 languages. But in code, I'm really a monoglot. All I do is JavaScript. And I don't want to get Glenn Beck on you, but I really love JavaScript. And I really love lots of the parts about it. Some things I've built before. So basically, before Node, and you want to build an app that's like a pure app that's only JavaScript, basically, you end up doing bookmarklets. So I did a whole shit ton of bookmarklets. The first one I did was TextPanda. I think these are still up, so you can check them if you want. TextPanda is like, have you guys Text Expander? Have you seen this thing? It's the same thing, but it's for the web. It's a bookmarklet. So you go to any web page, you get this little bookmarklet. You go to any web page, and you can save your own like shortcuts. So if you go to a web page and you click this button and you start typing, it'll automatically expand the things that you define into whatever phrases. So you can check that out. Another thing I built is called Typed In. This is basically a Japanese input method editor that's purely web-based. So even if you're like in an internet cafe and you want to type in Japanese for some reason to your clients who you're late giving translations for example, you can just go to any web page, click this bookmarklet, and all of a sudden you can type in Japanese, even if the OS doesn't allow it, doesn't have an input method editor. Another thing I built, and the last thing I built was called Pastebud. Some of you guys might actually have used this. This is copy and paste for the iPhone before the iPhone had copy and paste. And basically, it was a monster JavaScript hack using basically, some tenuous, very small server code and a bookmarklet to pull text and actually give you this pseudo, totally faked out, selectable web page where you could copy text and then send it to people. But the problem is, all these projects required. Are we done? All right, cool. Thank you. All of these projects required a little bit of server-side code, and I'm not a Ruby guy, and I really just want to use JavaScript all the way down. And so when Node came out, I was like ecstatic, and I wanted for all these things to build some sort of back end, and so that's where Fab comes in. So let me tell you about Fab. So first of all, Fab is a web framework. I'm sure you guys are familiar with how those work. So just to give you a sense of what it does, I'm going to compare it to other things that you might know. So for example, it's small. It's more web.py than Django. It's just tiny. It's one function and a small library of functions. It doesn't try to manage a huge thing. It basically starts small and lets you build on top of it. Next is it's more rack than Sinatra. Sinatra's really good at building endpoints, but not good at connecting them together. Sinatra relies on rack to connect all of these small apps together, and more people are moving to that kind of modular style where you build an app in Sinatra and use rack to connect them. So Fab is a lot like rack in that you build these tiny apps and all it does is connect them. It's agnostic, so it's more MERB than Rails 2. Everything is totally optional. You can swap whatever you want out. The things that are provided with Fab are only defaults, not necessarily at all, and they're all very loosely connected. Finally, it's succinct. It's more jQuery than UE. It's basically, instead of having lots of methods, you give it anything, and based on what you give it, it disambiguates what you mean to do with it. So I was very inspired by John Resnick's not only his chaining style, but this kind of let's keep it terse. And it's built on the good parts. So if you guys love functional programming like I do, you are going to like Fab because everything is functions. You write functions that return functions, and all Fab is just one function. There's no prototypes. There's no methods. All state is decentralized. So usually you have an app and you're like, add route, do this. It doesn't do any of that. Fab knows nothing about your app. The apps are responsible for storing the state of the HTTP in the app using closures. Also, callbacks. Fab is completely, you can't do a synchronous app with Fab. It's only asynchronous, and that's a compromise, but what it means is that because it's asynchronous all the way down, it becomes much easier to build things. You don't have to have special cases if it's synchronous or not. And it uses currying a lot. So basically, arity as a type system, by which I mean every app has an arity. That arity is how many apps it talks to. So every app takes arguments. Those arguments are just other apps. So everything is an app in the system. I can show you a little more about that. So Fab is a function. It's a tiny little function, and all it does is glue stuff together. It's, this small function, that's actually probably going to change. It might actually get smaller because there's some stuff I can take out of it. It's chainable. So if you guys like jQuery chaining as much as I do, this chains, but instead of using methods, it returns a function. So what I mean is, usually if you guys use jQuery used to chaining, what happens is you select something, do a method, it returns the jQuery object. You select something, it doesn't, right? This is a function that returns itself. So the function chains to itself, and so there's no methods. And so what ends up being is just a whole mess of parentheses, but you'll see how that works. And it's dumb, so it has no logic. It has no logic about apps. All it does is just connect your apps together. And by app, this is the Hello World app, right? It's very small. I'm actually going to go into the depth a little bit later, but that's basically the smallest you can get with Fab. And so what an app is just a function that curries. So it can either be a response, or it can return a function that returns a response. Or it can return a function that returns a function that returns a response, and we'll talk about how that works. It manages its own state. There's no, unlike jQuery would keep events somewhere and you can access that, you cannot introspect a Fab application because basically all apps are just very tiny apps that do one thing, and they're totally isolated. So they can only see their neighbor apps. They can't refer to any sort of central state. The only central state that an app would have access to is the Fab function, which basically acts as a namespace for all of these other apps. So the Fab source looks like this. So this is basically what the source code looks like. It's a function at the top, and then there's all of these default apps that you can use if you want to, and you don't have to. And at the end, there's defaults, like if you see a regex, use this app, this default path app that's provided by Fab. If you see a number, return a status. And you can totally override those too. And so basically what that means is, and this is probably the most salient slide for someone who has never seen Fab, your apps look like this, which is kind of jarring at the beginning. What I wanted to do is have your code, and this is valid JavaScript code. This literally executes just as is. There's no definition language. But I wanted Fab to look like markup. So you're basically, when you code your site looks like a sitemap. And so, everything here is, you can see these parens. So at the top, we're Fab equals require Fab. So we set, the Fab variable to be this require. And then all of these, so that's a regex, that does a path. And the next thing is a Node.js. That's just middleware that adapts it for Node.js. Then you have an app path that has your app. And then you can say filter on the method post, so you only reply to posts. You can use templates. This is built in. This is just Ressig's template engine. You can actually fetch files from the file system. There's also, you can proxy HTTP requests. That's based on Node, as you can tell by the namespace. And then it basically goes through, and if nothing matches, it can return this. And if nothing matches that original path of just a slash, it returns a 404. Anyway, so that's just a very quick what a Fab app looks like. But basically, this is how it works. You start off with a request. So HTTP, someone requests and you reply, right? So if you have, this is basically this whole, actually, I guess I'll bring the app in. So this is the browser and this is your app. Does that make sense? So basically, if you separate these two things, that is inbound and this represents an outbound function. So when you, to return stuff, you call this function. And to call stuff further in your app, you call that function. You'll see how that works. So basically, the idea is, when I say that we are defining apps in terms of their arity, how many apps they talk to. So this app talks to one app. It just has one little bump there, right? So I call it a unary app. And so if you have an app that talks to two apps, so here's one that goes outbound, here's one that goes inbound, that is a binary app. When we call this in web jargon, we call this middleware. But I'm going to introduce one more type of app, and that is, rather predictably, a ternary app. So that's an app that talks to one app downstream and two apps upstream. And basically what that allows you to do is branching and all sorts of stuff that you'll see. So your fab app is just chaining these three kinds of apps together. There's nothing else. There's no methods. There's no setting of anything. You write apps, and you just put them into this like fab connector, and out comes a web app that does hopefully what you want it to. So it uses currying, right? So if you have an app of arity 3 and an app of arity 1, what that means is when those two apps talk to each other, they create a binary app, right? So that's like currying, right? Likewise, if you have a binary app and you connect that to a unary app, what you create is another unary app, right? So it's just simple math, right? And so the whole idea is that when you have these apps take other apps, they end up creating just a simple responder that then is a unary app that can talk to like a web server. Very quickly, example apps. Here's Hello World. I showed you that earlier. Here is Hello World again. This time we're calling, so basically this, in any fab app, this represents the downstream app. So that's basically whenever you're done, you want to send some information, you send it into this. And it chains because the downstream app returns a listener that you can then send more stuff to, right? So first we just send run response. You can actually chain this and send responses. It's asynchronous. You can just keep sending. And then when you see this empty thing, you're sending nothing. And when you send nothing, that means I'm done. You can close this. So it's very important for asynchronous stuff. When you say you're done, it can close it and then deliver the response. So there's a parallelism here. If the upstream app wants to say I'm done, it sends nothing. If the downstream app wants to say I'm not interested in what you have to say anymore, it returns nothing, i.e. it doesn't return a listener. Does that make sense? So that parallel is kind of nice. So here's another thing. This is just a JSCI style response. So basically, whenever you send a response, it's optional. You can send just a status. You can send just headers. You can send just a body. But you can send full responses like this. For example, here's Hello World. So it's asynchronous. So you can do stuff like this. And oops, did I skip one? Here is, so basically, when you have, because your app it only sees other apps. So how do you know, like for example, where do we put stuff like the method or the URL? And that stuff basically is you call an app. So what we're doing here is Hello World 5 is returning a function. That's a listener for the downstream app that can then call that function again, right? And so when it calls it, we have this thing that we do, and we we basically echo the name of the path. The first thing that's sent is the head. That contains the method, the URL, the headers, and the next thing that are sent is body. So as long as you return something, here's another example, as long as you return a listener, you can keep getting events, right? So for example, this is a working app, and all this stuff is on the fab site. You can run this code. All this does is it tells you how many bytes have been sent, right? So it just keeps returning a listener, and it keeps counting the bytes. So those are all unary apps. So if we want to show you a binary app, here's an example. So here's an example of a binary app, which is middleware, that takes an app, and when that app is called, it increments a counter, and then it calls that app. Does that make sense? So this last line is probably, the most important. Return app call this. So you're taking this upstream app, you're calling it with this. This, in this case, is the downstream app. So you're connecting those two together. So what that means is, middleware, there's no overhead of, like for example, middleware, if you're constantly shuttling stuff between the upstream app and the downstream app, with this you don't have to do that, because basically when you return the listener that this guy returns, what you're doing is you're connecting those two apps immediately, and so you don't have access to that communication anymore, which is nice because you can avoid a lot of overhead that way. So here's an example of a ternary app. Here's an app called Only Tuesday. All right? It has two upstream apps, yes and no. And if it's Tuesday, it'll go to the yes app. And if it's not Tuesday, it'll go to the no app. So this is an example of how you can use a ternary app to do switching. And this is, for example, how Fab has no idea of a router. All a router is a path app. You give it a matching app. You give it a regex that has a pattern that matches the path. You give it a matches and a non-matches app. And basically, if it matches, it'll dish out to either one. So a router is just chaining those ternary apps together, which you'll see. So I'm going to start with 3 examples. Here's Hello World. Here's date time. Here's browser focus. I actually changed the name of these. I forgot to change the slide. But you can see that we're going to build stuff that's very, very modular. And I'm going to show you one by one how it actually works. And you can actually follow along if you want. If you have Node installed, the latest version of Node, please, you can run this as I'm going. So starting with the first app, Hello.js. So we want an app that does this. If you call root, it returns a 404. If you call hello, it returns hello world. And if you call hello with any sort of variable after hello, it'll just echo that variable back to you, right? So here's what this app looks like in Fab. Here's the Node boilerplate, right, for running a server. We're going to add, see, we have Fab up there, and it's calling 404, right? So this says, whenever you call, just return a 404. That's not very interesting. Let's add some middleware. Here is the middleware that allows you to use this on Node. And it's just Node middleware. The adapter for Node is, there's no magic. It's just another binary app that connects 2 things together. In this case, it'll turn your app into a Node-compatible listener. All right, so now let's add a ternary app. So this is a regex pattern. It calls an app on Fab called fab.path. And basically, if it matches this path, it dishes out this way. Otherwise, it dishes out this way. Does that make sense? I'm talking really fast. Does anyone have any questions? Feel free to shout out anytime. I haven't timed this, so if I'm going over, please give me like a 5-minute or something. OK, cool. So now we're gonna turn this string. So as you can see, at any point you can see whether your app is complete because there's no bumps and there's no divots, right? So this whole thing is well connected. What that means is if this starts with hello, we're going to return this string, which you'll see obviously is going to be a template. And if not, we're going to return a 404. So let's actually fill that template in. So now we have this resig, real simple template engine. So now I'm actually going to render that string. But now you can see we have a little thing here. Our app is not complete. So what if it doesn't? If it matches hello, we're going to put this here, right? So now this app is complete. We have world. So this world gets passed to this thing, which renders it, right? And so now our app is complete. So now all this is, if you hit the root, you will get a 404. If you hit hello, you will get a hello world. That's not very interesting. So let's put the name in. So we're going to put in another ternary app. Again, this is just a path app. This has a regular expression, and you'll see there's parentheses. It'll capture what's in the parentheses, and then there's a fab app called fab.capture. It'll return that value, right? So basically, here's this ternary app right here, and if it doesn't match, it'll return world, and if it does match, it'll return whatever's captured, right? That's how we built that app. Any questions? All right, sorry. All right, here's another app, date. This one's kind of stupid. Basically, if I get root, return a JSON encoded date object. If I get date, format that into a date. And if I get time, format that into time. OK, so this is how this app works. Node boilerplate. We're going to return a new date. So this is a date. And so basically, if Fab sees something that's not a function, by default, it returns it as a body. So we take this date, and we put it in the body and return it as a response. But we need the node adapter. And we actually, let's say in this case, we want a content length. So we have a content length plugin that's for Node. And if in this case, we also want to stringify it. You can't return, right? Node needs you to return a string. So we have an app that just all it does is just dish out to stringify. All right. So now this is a working app, OK? But it's not very interesting. So let's add date and time. These are 2 paths. And now we've created 2 divots. We need to fill those in. And we're going to fill them in with these strings. Again, these are going to be template strings. And we're just calling these methods of the date object, native JavaScript. All right, so let's, for those where I actually want to put a template in, right? So basically, all a template does is this. It talks to 2 apps. This is why a template is, usually you think of a template as binary, it's ternary. This is why. The first app it calls is the template string. So what this means is it's agnostic. You can put a string in there, or you can dish out to a file. It doesn't matter. All that app knows is that when it calls the first app, it's going to get back a string, right? And so it uses that to create a function, and it caches that function. So all subsequent requests from the second app are going to go through that function. All right, so here's the thing. For both of these, we want to pass a date. But we've already cleared the date down here. Now, what you could do is you could put new date right here. But what actually Fab lets you do is leave it empty. And what that does is whatever comes next, pass that. All right, so what this means is this is going to be filled with this date. Does that make sense? So you only had to declare the date once. So we're trying to keep the repetition to a minimal. So basically, think of this as optional middleware. This middleware is only called if it matches this URL. Does that make sense? And so it's the same date object, and it gets rendered differently based on the URL. All right? Does that make sense? Any questions? All right, cool.
If it matches both, what happens?
If it matches, it'll only get the first one. Yeah, so that's the idea. Think of a ternary app as a ternary operator in JavaScript, right? If you have a bunch of ternary operators in JavaScript, the first one that gets called, that rest of the code is not evaluated. It's the same thing. Does that make sense? All right, so actually, let's start focus. I want to show you, there's no point in showing you stuff that's just, you could do it in Sinatra. So I'd like to show you, I don't know if you can see this, but I'm going to take 3 browsers. All right, and so I built an app called Focus. And what this app does is, it's asynchronous. It uses long polling. I'm going to show you how it's built. And basically, you open it in a bunch of browsers, and whatever browser has Focus, it gets sent to the rest of the browsers, so you can, well, it's probably better just to show you. All right, cool. So I'm going to call this, there's no magic here. I'm doing this real time and hope it works. Open this in all these. All right, cool. So you guys can see, right, just by focusing on these apps, it sends it in real time. And if it doesn't know the app, like for example, if we're coming from something that doesn't send a user agent, it'll, oops, what's up? Well, it's supposed to say other. Anyway, that's the idea. So that takes advantage of the node makes asynchronous stuff really cool, right? It's like really easy to build asynchronous stuff. And so, but the thing is, frameworks usually are like the bare minimum easy stuff. I want to build a framework that like lives on asynchronous and lets you build stuff like this very, very easily. Does everyone get what just happened there? Is that cool? You understand that, right? All right, not too complicated. All right.
Can we look at the code for that?
Oh, you can. Oh, wow, that's a great plant. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. I will show you the code for this. Here's what it looks like. OK, cool. Node boilerplate. We're going to return a string. This is just an HTML string, right? OK, this app is done. Well, it's not really done because we need the node adapter as usual. And then you see the string calls 2 scripts. All right, well, we need to send those scripts. All right, so let's send those scripts. So we need 2 other paths, one for init and one for jQuery. For init, we're going to take client and put it to string. Now, where's client? Client is, right, we haven't defined client. Well, let's define client. Client is a function. All right, this function is going to get toStringed and then sent to the browser. OK, so all this is just jQuery. Right, so we have a listen function that listens, and when it gets a response, it listens again, and when it gets a response, it listens again. This is long polling. And then we have on focus, get this thing that says focused. Right, so it's got kind of this constant long polling connection, and then when it focuses, it sends this, it fetches this focus URL. All right, so we put that in there, but the thing is, you can't just include a function. This is a script, right? If we just put a function, it's not going to get evaluated. So I'm actually going to create a template, right? And all it does is it puts that into closure, and it executes it. Does that make sense? So now I've returned this function, that's this automatically executing function, where the code was written on the server in JavaScript. We just put that in a string that's like at the bottom of this file. So you can, you don't have to keep, the whole point is I want to be agnostic. I hate these frameworks where it's like your layouts go here and your views go here. It's like whatever you want to do is cool. I will help you allow that. So the whole idea is just to be agnostic about that. So now we need to send jQuery. Well, we can use file system. And so this is going to dish out to the file system. This app is a binary app, right? Usually you think a file system is just a handler. This is a binary app. It calls and it gets back a string that represents the path, and then it fetches that file, and then it returns whatever is in that file. So we're just going to call jQuery that just dishes out to the file system. OK? All right. So now this app is complete, but it's not really because when you focus, like we're going to call these URLs that don't exist. So let's put those URLs in. Listen and focused, right? You guys remember these. So listen. All right, now here's where this is like what the cool thing about this is it's asynchronous. So we have this handler, and we're just pushing the current listener to this array that we now have at the top, right? We're not responding at all. This is the whole point of long polling. We're going to respond when something changes. OK, so now we just need to fill in the focus part. So now I created this function just for this app called broadcast, and it looks like this. It's pretty simple. It takes an array. It takes a function that returns an array of listeners, right? Because we want to keep everything within this whole app paradigm. It returns a response immediately, a blank response that has nothing in it. So it tells it, like, you're done. OK, so it'll return a 200, and you don't need to do any more. Then it'll call the downstream app, and then it'll get its feedback, and it'll chain it through to all the listeners that you've pushed in this array. right? So that's basically, the cool thing about what this does is, this is now totally reusable. We could reuse this in another app. It's not specific to our app at all because we built it as a binary app, as middleware, and not as an app that belongs in some sort of hierarchy somewhere. So we're going to put that in, and here after it, we're going to put the listeners that we want to send it to. But we still haven't sent a response yet. So we want to send the user agent. Now, this is not a magical function. This is just a function I defined here. This is just a hack. Based on your user agent, I'm going to send you some string, and it only works for these strings, and apparently not even for other, as you saw. So we're going to put that in there, but we can't just return it. We need to do something with it, right? So I'm going to put in a template, and it's going to call this JavaScript code, right? This is just jQuery code, and it's going to render that user agent into a function that will then get executed. All right? So now at this point, I think your app is entirely complete, right? There's no bumps anywhere, okay? Does that make sense? This is what the app looks like. And then the cool thing about this, because you've built everything so modularly, you can totally map it. You understand where everything goes. You can actually have a very over-the-top animation that shows you. Sorry, I was seeing all these presentations, all these really masterful guys. It's like, there's like words on the page, and I was like, oh man, it's just a sucker for the keynote candy. All right, so that was that. All right, so now what? So this is the final stretch here. I need to improve the docs, tests, and examples. Yeah, examples are okay. Docs need a lot of work. Tests need a lot of work. There are no tests. There were tests in the last version, and I kind of got rid of them when I updated to the latest thing. So I need to work on a lot of tests. The cool thing is because all these apps are tiny, the tests are also specific to a single app. So what I'm envisioning is when you ship an app, anytime you add an app to Fab or to your own app anywhere, you add a test just for that app. And it doesn't have to belong in a hierarchy. All it knows is that something comes in and something goes out. So you can put an app on either side that helps you test it. I want to promote an ecosystem of apps. So just like jQuery really gave this ecosystem of plugins because now it's really easy to build a plugin. You just put it in jQuery. I want to have the same thing for the server. These apps are tiny. I want to be able to build all these tiny little apps and be like, oh, I have an app that does this, go there. Right? So Fab doesn't maintain it. Someone else maintains it, right? And then you can use it. And as long as they conform to this really, really simple spec, then hopefully you'd be able to share those things pretty easily. And so just like jQuery, if there's apps that are really popular and people want them, I would like to merge them into core so that you can just download it and just build stuff instantly. And then finally, I want to add support for other platforms. And I tried to do this for this demo. I couldn't get it done in time because of the beer. But basically, the idea is this. There's nothing magical about this that belongs on the server, right? You could do this in the client. Here's my plan. My next platform for Fab is jQuery. And the idea is this. You download a server into your browser. Does that make sense? OK, so a Fab app is just something that responds to these paths, right? It's just HTTP. So what I'd like to do is you actually download an app, and you can actually build stuff where it just runs in the browser without hitting the server unless you want to. And so you can agnostically. So then it would be really easy to find an app on the server, render it, to find an app on the client, render it there, but basically you can be agnostic about where you render. So you can actually have the same site. Google will see your HTML site, and the client will see your JSON, right? And the only thing you change is one Boolean that flips which path they go to. Does that make sense? So that's the final thing I want to do. So that's what I'll be doing over the next week and change, and next few. I'm going to build stuff on top of this next for my own stuff. And so I encourage, if you guys like this, I encourage you to help me out. And it's, just write an app and point me to it. And, if it's cool, put it in if people use it. And so this is how I'd like to proceed. And that is it. Thank you. Any questions? Yes?
How stable is the API that you're shipping right now?
Well, it's built on top of nodes. As you saw, the API is really simple. I've gone through a lot of iterations. I think it's pretty stable. There's very few moving parts, right? The whole idea is that you just build functions, and it's just like a closure that returns other functions. I'm pretty sure the API is stable, but don't quote me on it until it hits 1, right? But it's stable enough that I'm building stuff on top of it. But yeah, no promises until it gels a little bit more.
Have you thought about how errors get propagated through? I mean, besides the 404? Something else goes wrong?
Something else goes wrong in your Fab app.
Somewhere down inside of the nested binary chain.
I haven't thought about that as much. I imagine in some case you would have to build your app to try catch blocks, just put them in your app. But yeah, I mean, ideally you'd want to propagate the error as a code and then maybe have a sniffer. So for example, you could create middleware. When I say middleware, I mean a binary app. I'd love to have people adapt this jargon if you guys like it. Have a binary app that basically all it does is it looks for something that comes down, and if it comes down with a certain error code, it then returns a specific response. Does that make sense? So the whole idea is to, as much as possible, keep it in the chain, and then use the brilliance of HTTP to solve problems like that. That's the idea. All right. Any other questions? Yes.
If an app, like apps as in the apps you talk about as binary, are just functions, could you split a fab app into as many files as you want and include them in the fab block as?
Exactly. Yes. In fact, if you look at fab, the 3 apps I showed you, they are actually apps that are sitting in another app. So like it's just apps all the way down, right? A fab app itself is a valid fab app. Anything you create with fab itself is a valid fab app. So the idea is that you're very agnostic about what you want to put in the file system, what you want to separate. It's just as long as you have some way of getting it out of that file. So for example, I use module.exports in Node, right? And so what that does is the only way to return a function, because usually with exports you have to return an object and then put a function on it and then have all these redundant names everywhere. So I use module.exports and I just turn the function. And so if you look at the source code in the examples in fab, it has stuff like that. Yeah. All right. Cool. Oh, yes.
What are the limitations? You're saying you want to get this in the browser? Is that right?
Yes.
What are the limitations? It's on Node right now. I don't know.
Limitations of Node?
Node's not running the browser, right?
Oh, right. All right. Is that Node's not running the browser? Right. Yes, Node is not running the browser. It would run on jQuery. But the whole idea is that notice there's nothing specific about Node in this. Everything that's Node is a separate app that does stuff for Node. Does that make sense? Yeah. Fab itself is totally agnostic. Yeah, so like it shouldn't be too hard to port it to jQuery. I'd like just to port it straight to the browser as long as we can get Ajax, pretty good Ajax, and pretty good back button support. Basically the stuff that Aaron works on, Sammy, stuff like that. Yeah, I feel like those would be the 2 core things you would need. All right, cool. Thank you guys.